Rachel Evans was only 24 years old when she found herself lost in the rain, walking alone through the Vermont mountains with nowhere left to go. She had no family waiting for her, no place to call home. When she finally spotted the faint light of a lonely cabin hidden deep in the forest, she believed she was only asking for shelter from the storm. She couldn't possibly know. The woman living inside had been waiting for someone like her for years. That one knock changed everything. It didn't just save Rachel from the storm. It led her to the family she never thought she'd find. And before this story ends, you'll understand why one rainy night transformed two lonely lives forever. Some people spend their whole lives searching for a place to belong. Rachel Evans spent hers searching for someone who would simply call her family. On the night our story begins, she had almost stopped believing she would ever find either. Rain poured across the Vermont mountains, turning the narrow road into a river of mud. Cold wind swept through the pine trees as Rachel pulled her worn coat tighter around herself. She was 24 years old, carrying everything she owned in one faded backpack. Inside, it was a change of clothes, a few dollars, and a small leather Bible wrapped carefully in plastic to keep it dry. It was the only gift she had left from the woman who once called her daughter. Rachel never knew her birth parents. She grew up moving from one foster home to another, learning not to unpack her suitcase because nothing ever lasted. Then, at 13, Harold and Linda Evans welcomed her into their little farmhouse outside a quiet Vermont town. For the first time, someone baked her a birthday cake. For the first time, someone kissed her forehead before bed. For the first time, she believed she had finally found home. Years later, when Linda became ill with cancer, Rachel quietly gave up her dream of becoming a nurse. She worked wherever she could, washing dishes, cleaning motel rooms, stocking grocery shelves so the family could afford another round of treatment. She never regretted it. One autumn evening, Linda placed her worn Bible into Rachel's hands. "Promise me one thing," she whispered. Rachel smiled through her tears. "Anything." Linda gently squeezed her hand. "Never let pain decide the kind of person you become." 3 weeks later, Linda was gone. The little farmhouse never felt the same again. Harold tried to keep everything together, but grief changes people in ways they never expect. After he remarried, Rachel slowly became a stranger inside the only home she had ever known. One rainy morning, she found her backpack waiting by the front door. There was a small envelope with $200 inside. Nothing else. Harold couldn't even bring himself to look her in the eye. Rachel hugged him anyway. "I know you loved her," she whispered. "They would have wanted you to stay," he replied, his voice breaking. "So would I." Then she walked away. 6 months passed. Rachel drifted from town to town, taking whatever work she could find. Some nights she rented the cheapest motel room she could afford. Most nights she couldn't. Yet somehow, she never stopped noticing people who were hurting. That evening, after finishing a long shift at a roadside diner, Rachel bought herself a bowl of soup and a loaf of bread. Before she could take a single bite, she saw an elderly veteran sitting alone beneath a broken bus shelter, shivering in the rain. Without hesitation, she handed him the food. The old man stared at her. "What are you going to eat?" Rachel smiled softly. "I'll be all right." He lowered his head. "I hope life is kinder to you than it has been." Rachel touched the Bible inside her backpack. "It already has," she said. "I was loved once." She turned and walked into the storm. An hour later, the rain grew even heavier. Darkness swallowed the mountain road. Rachel's hands were numb. Her legs trembled with every step. For the first time in months, she whispered a prayer. Lord, I don't need a miracle tonight. She looked into the darkness ahead. I just need somewhere to rest. Then, through the curtain of rain, she saw it, a warm golden light shining between the trees. An old wooden cabin stood quietly on the hillside, its windows glowing against the storm. Rachel thought she had found shelter for one cold night. She had no idea that inside the cabin, Ruth Anderson had been praying for years that God would send her one more chance to love someone like a daughter. Rachel stood on the weathered porch for several long seconds before she finally found the courage to knock. Rain streamed from the edge of the roof, soaking her sleeves all over again. Her fingers were so cold she could barely curl them into a fist. She knocked once. The sound was almost swallowed by the storm. For a moment, she considered turning around. After enough disappointments, people begin to expect every door to remain closed. She raised her hand again. This time, she knocked a little harder. Inside the cabin, Ruth Anderson slowly lifted her head from the rocking chair beside the fireplace. An old novel rested open on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. Rain always made the cabin feel quieter, lonelier. She carefully closed the book. Perhaps it was only a branch striking the porch. Then came another knock. 3 gentle taps. Ruth pushed herself to her feet. At 69, her movements were slower than they once had been, but decades as a nurse had taught her one lesson she never forgot. If someone was asking for help, you answered. She walked to the door and opened it. A gust of icy wind swept into the room. Standing beneath the porch light was a young woman drenched from head to toe. Her coat clung to her shoulders. Her boots were caked with mud, and an old backpack hung heavily from one shoulder. For a long heartbeat, they simply looked at one another. Rachel offered a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to bother you." Her voice trembled from the cold. "I was wondering if maybe I could stay on your porch until the storm passes." Ruth studied her for only a second. Then she stepped aside. "No one waits out a mountain storm on my porch." She opened the door wider. "You come inside." Rachel blinked. "I don't have any money." "I'm not asking for any. I'll leave first thing in the morning." Ruth smiled gently. "We'll worry about tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" There was something about the older woman's voice. Something calm. Something familiar. For just an instant, Rachel heard Linda again. She quietly stepped across the doorway. Warmth surrounded her immediately. The cabin smelled of cedar wood, fresh bread, and hot tea. A fire crackled inside a large stone fireplace, filling the room with soft amber light. It wasn't a large place, just a cozy living room, a small kitchen, and shelves lined with books and old family photographs. But it felt lived in, loved. Ruth disappeared down the hallway and returned carrying 2 thick towels. "Dry your hair before you catch your death." Rachel accepted one with both hands. "Thank you." Ruth smiled. "My mother used to say gratitude sounds even sweeter around a warm fire." Rachel laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. Ruth placed a kettle on the stove. "Tea. I'd love some. And don't tell me you're not hungry." Rachel lowered her eyes. "I already had dinner." Ruth looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "The truth." Rachel hesitated. "I gave it away." Ruth paused. "To an older man. Someone you knew." Rachel shook her head. "No." "Then why?" Rachel shrugged as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "He looked like he needed it more than I did." For a few quiet seconds, Ruth said nothing. She simply ladled homemade vegetable soup into a bowl, sliced 2 thick pieces of warm bread, and placed everything on the table. Rachel tried to eat slowly. She really did, but hunger eventually took over. Without saying a word, Ruth quietly filled the bowl again. As they sat together, Rachel's eyes wandered toward the mantel above the fireplace. Several framed photographs rested there. One showed a younger Ruth standing beside a smiling man. Another showed a little girl holding a fishing pole nearly taller than herself. Rachel smiled. "Your granddaughter?" Ruth's eyes softened. "No, my daughter." Rachel immediately looked away. "I'm sorry." Ruth gently picked up the picture and brushed a little dust from the frame. Her name was Hannah. Rachel remained silent. She had learned that sometimes the greatest kindness was simply giving someone space to remember. "She would be about your age now," Ruth said quietly. The fire crackled between them. "I spent 40 years taking care of other people's families." A faint smile crossed her face. "When I finally retired, I thought I'd have time to enjoy my own." She looked into the flames. Life had other plans. Rachel didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. Loss has a way of recognizing itself. A few moments later, Ruth noticed Rachel looking toward the bookshelf. "Do you enjoy reading?" "I used to." "What changed?" Rachel smiled sadly. "Life got busy." Ruth chuckled. "It usually does." She walked to the shelf and pulled out an old hardcover novel. The bindings falling apart. Rachel smiled. "So am I." For the first time that evening, they both laughed together. It wasn't a loud laugh, just enough to make the cabin feel a little less empty. Outside, the storm continued to pound against the windows. Wind bent the tall pine trees surrounding the cabin. Ruth placed another log on the fire. Without looking up, she asked quietly, "Where were you planning to sleep tonight?" Rachel stared into the flames. "I hadn't figured that out yet." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she spoke words that neither of them would ever forget. "There's a bedroom at the end of the hallway." Rachel quickly shook her head. "Oh, I couldn't." "You could." "I don't want to be a burden." Ruth smiled with the gentle wisdom of someone who had lived through more sorrow than she ever expected. "My dear," she said softly, "do you know what I've learned after nearly 70 years? Rachel shook her head. "The heaviest burden in this house." Ruth glanced toward the empty rocking chair across the fireplace. "There's never been another person." She looked back at Rachel. "It has always been the empty seat." Rachel felt tears gather in her eyes, not because she was hurting, but because someone had just made room for her without asking for anything in return. Outside, the storm showed no sign of ending. Inside that quiet little cabin, something far more important had begun. 2 lonely souls, each believing life had already passed them by, had unknowingly become the answer to each other's prayers. Rachel slept more peacefully that night than she had in months. It wasn't because the bed was especially comfortable. The mattress was old. The blankets had been mended more than once. The room itself was small, with faded curtains and a single wooden dresser that had probably stood in the same corner for decades. Outside, rain still tapped gently against the windows. But for the first time in a very long while, Rachel wasn't lying awake wondering where she would sleep tomorrow. She woke to the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon. For one beautiful moment, before opening her eyes, she almost believed she was back in Linda's farmhouse. Then reality quietly returned. Linda was gone. The farmhouse was gone. She was still a stranger, simply spending one night in another person's home. Old habits never leave us completely. Before stepping into the hallway, Rachel carefully folded the blankets and made the bed. Linda had always told her, "Leave Every place a little better than you found it. When Rachel entered the kitchen, Ruth was standing by the stove flipping pancakes while morning sunlight poured through the windows. Outside, fresh snow covered the mountains, making the entire forest sparkle beneath the pale winter sun. Ruth smiled. "Good morning." Rachel smiled back. "Can I help?" "You already have." Rachel looked puzzled. "You slept?" Ruth chuckled softly. "You have no idea how quiet this house has been." They shared breakfast together. Nothing extraordinary. Pancakes, coffee, a little homemade jam. They talked about books, about the weather, about the maple trees that surrounded the cabin. Simple conversations, the kind most people never remember. Yet, for two lonely people, they felt priceless. After breakfast, Rachel noticed one of the wooden shutters outside banging against the wall in the breeze. "If you don't mind," she said, "I'd like to fix that." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You know how. My foster father taught me." Within minutes, Rachel had borrowed a ladder and a toolbox. The loose shutter was repaired in no time. Then she spotted a section of broken fence. She fixed that too. Before lunchtime, she had stacked fresh firewood beside the porch, shoveled snow from the front steps, tightened a loose railing, and even repaired a squeaky kitchen cabinet door. Ruth stood quietly at the window watching. No one had taken care of the cabin like this in years. Not because Rachel had been asked, simply because she noticed things that needed attention. Late that afternoon, Rachel carried another armful of firewood into the living room. As she knelt beside the fireplace, one of the old floorboards shifted beneath her weight. She frowned. "That's strange." Ruth looked up from her knitting. "What is... This board is loose." "It has been for years." Rachel smiled. "Would you mind if I fixed it while I'm here?" Ruth nodded. "Go right ahead." Rachel fetched a hammer and carefully lifted the old plank. She expected to find nothing more than dust. Instead, she stopped. Hidden between the floor joists rested a small wooden box. Both women stared in silence. Ruth slowly stood. "I've lived here for 15 years, she whispered. "I never knew that was there." The box was beautifully made, though age had darkened the wood and turned its brass latch green. Rachel carefully lifted it out and handed it to Ruth. "I think you should be the one to open it." Ruth held the box for several quiet moments before gently lifting the lid. Inside lay several yellowed envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them rested an old leather journal. Ruth opened the cover. Written in careful handwriting were 2 words. "Samuel Anderson, my grandfather," she whispered. "I thought these were gone forever." With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The paper had become fragile with age. She began reading aloud. "If you are reading this, it means this house has once again welcomed someone who needed it." Rachel looked up. The room fell completely silent. Ruth continued. "Never allow this cabin to become only a house. It was built to be a refuge. Storms will always send weary travelers. Some will have lost their homes. Some will have lost the people they love. Some will believe they belong nowhere. Open the door. Share your table. Listen before you judge. One day, someone will do the same for someone you love." When Ruth finished reading, neither woman spoke. Only the gentle crackle of the fire filled the room. Finally, Ruth folded the letter with great care. "My grandfather wrote this after the Great Depression," she said quietly. "He and my grandmother opened this cabin to anyone stranded by snowstorms." She looked around the room. "For years, I thought this cabin was where I came to hide from the world." Her eyes filled with tears. "Maybe I misunderstood why it was built." Rachel glanced toward the remaining letters. "There are more. Together, they spent the rest of the afternoon reading story after story. A traveling salesman trapped by a blizzard. A young soldier returning home after the war. A widow carrying 2 small children. A teenage boy with nowhere left to go. Different people, different lives. Yet every story ended with the same simple truth. Someone had opened the door. As evening settled over the mountains, Rachel quietly placed the last letter back into the box. It changed so many lives. Ruth nodded. It did. Then, after a long silence, she smiled. And perhaps, she said softly, story isn't over yet. Rachel wasn't sure why those words touched her so deeply. Perhaps because, for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to imagine something beyond tomorrow. Not just surviving, living. Outside, fresh snow drifted gently through the forest. Inside the little cabin, 2 lonely women sat beside a warm fire, surrounded by the stories of strangers who had once arrived with nothing, and left carrying hope. Neither of them realized that another test was already making its way up the mountain road. One that would force Rachel to decide whether this cabin was simply a place to rest, or the first place she had ever been willing to call home. The storm was finally gone. Morning sunlight stretched across the snow-covered hills, turning the mountains into waves of gold and silver. Thin curls of smoke drifted from the cabin's stone chimney while everything around it seemed calm again. For the first time in many months, Rachel wasn't thinking about where she would go next. She still reminded herself that she was only a guest. But each new morning seemed to begin the same way. She rose before Ruth, started a fresh pot of coffee, carried firewood inside before the cold reached the house, scattered birdseed outside the kitchen window for the cardinals that arrived every morning. Small things, simple things, the kind of quiet routines that slowly transform a house into a home. One afternoon, Rachel stopped in front of an old photograph hanging in the hallway. It showed a much younger Ruth wearing a nurse's uniform, standing proudly in front of a small brick building. The faded sign above the entrance read, Maple Ridge Community Clinic. Rachel smiled. You really loved being a nurse, didn't you? Ruth walked over and looked at the picture. A warm smile crossed her face. I never thought of it as work. She gently brushed a finger across the frame. It was simply where I believed I was supposed to be. Rachel lowered her eyes. After a quiet moment, she admitted something she had carried in her heart for years. I wanted to become a nurse too. Ruth turned toward her. You never told me that. I was accepted into community college. Rachel smiled faintly. I even bought my first anatomy book. What happened? Rachel looked out the window where snowflakes still rested on the pine branches. Linda got sick. There wasn't enough money, so I went to work instead. She shrugged gently. It felt like the right choice. Ruth remained silent for a moment. Do you regret it? Rachel thought carefully before answering. I miss the dream. A soft smile returned to her face. But I'll never regret loving her. Those words stayed with Ruth long after the conversation ended. For years, she had believed grief only left empty spaces. Listening to Rachel, she realized something else. Sometimes, love leaves strength behind. That evening, while organizing the old letters they had found beneath the floor, Ruth noticed another envelope hidden inside her grandfather's journal. It had her name written across the front. She frowned. I've never seen this before. Rachel looked up from where she was adding another log to the fire. What does it say? Ruth carefully unfolded the fragile paper. Dear Ruth, if you're reading this, I am no longer here to tell you these things myself. There may come a season when this cabin feels too quiet, when the empty chairs hurt more than the memories, when closing the door feels safer than opening your heart. Don't believe that feeling. A closed door keeps sorrow outside, but it also keeps love from finding its way back. If the Lord ever sends someone to this porch who needs a home, don't ask how long they'll stay. Ask why He trusted you to welcome them. Ruth slowly lowered the letter. Her hands trembled slightly. For so many years she had convinced herself that living alone meant she had finally found peace. Now she wasn't so sure. Perhaps she had simply become comfortable with loneliness. Rachel watched quietly. "You all right?" Ruth smiled through tear-filled eyes. "I think my grandfather is still teaching me." The next morning brought another surprise. Someone knocked on the front door. Rachel glanced through the window and saw an old pickup truck parked outside. An elderly man climbed out carrying a metal toolbox. Ruth smiled. "That's Walter, my closest neighbor." Walter stepped inside, brushing snow from his boots. "Morning, Ruth." Then he noticed Rachel. "Oh, I didn't know you had company." Ruth smiled warmly. "This is Rachel." Walter reached out his hand. "It's nice to meet you." Over coffee, the conversation drifted from the weather to repairs around the property. Then Walter mentioned something that immediately changed the mood. The county sent another notice. Ruth's smile faded. "I know." Rachel looked between them. "What notice?" Ruth hesitated. "It's nothing." Walter gently shook his head. "No, Ruth, it isn't nothing." He sighed. "It's the property taxes." Rachel frowned. "What about them?" Ruth quietly folded her grandfather's letter and slipped it back into the envelope. "I've fallen behind." Walter spoke gently. "They've given you until spring. If the balance isn't paid—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Rachel understood. The cabin could be taken away. Silence settled over the room. Walter quickly changed the subject, realizing he had already said enough, but Rachel couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, after Ruth had gone to bed, Rachel remained alone beside the fireplace. She looked around the cabin. The photographs, the books, the old rocking chair, Samuel Anderson's letters. Every corner held someone's memory. Every floorboard carried another story of kindness. She remembered one line from Samuel's letter. "Open the door. Share your table. Listen before you judge." Rachel whispered the words quietly to herself. Then another thought entered her heart. This cabin had given her shelter when she had nowhere left to go. Maybe now it was her turn to protect the place that had protected her. For the first time since leaving the Evans farmhouse, Rachel stopped asking herself where she belonged. Instead, she began wondering how she could save the only place that had ever welcomed her without asking for anything in return. Across the hallway, Ruth lay awake in bed. She wasn't sleeping either. She picked up the old family photograph from her bedside table and smiled through quiet tears. For years she had prayed for the loneliness to end. She had imagined the answer would come through some extraordinary miracle. Instead, it arrived on a cold, rain-soaked night. Wearing a worn-out coat, carrying an old backpack, and asking for nothing more than a place to escape the storm. Neither of them realized it yet, but they had already become part of each other's story, and the greatest test of that new family was still waiting just beyond the mountain road. The following morning, Rachel was already outside before sunrise. Fresh snow crunched beneath her boots as she carried another armful of firewood toward the porch. The air was crisp, and the mountains were wrapped in a peaceful silence that only winter could bring. Yet her mind was anything but quiet. She couldn't stop thinking about what Walter had said. If the property taxes weren't paid by spring, Ruth could lose the cabin. The thought settled heavily in her heart. This little house had given her warmth when she had nowhere else to go. It had given her kindness when she expected rejection. And somehow, in only a few short days, it had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she had ever lived. Rachel couldn't bear the thought of seeing another home disappear. Over breakfast, she finally spoke. "How much do you owe?" Ruth looked up from her coffee. "Enough." Rachel smiled faintly. "That's not an answer." Ruth sighed. "A little over $12,000. Rachel nearly dropped her spoon. "That's impossible." "It feels that way sometimes." Ruth tried to smile, but it never quite reached her eyes. "I've managed for years by living simply. When my medical bills started piling up, I kept telling myself I'd catch up next season." She looked around the cabin. "But seasons have a way of passing faster than we expect." Rachel sat quietly. $12,000 might as well have been $1 million. Neither of them had that kind of money. Still, Rachel refused to believe this story would end with another goodbye. Later that afternoon, she walked into the old workshop behind the cabin. Dust covered nearly every shelf. Broken furniture leaned against the walls. Old tools hung where they had rested for decades. As Rachel wandered through the room, she noticed several beautifully handcrafted wooden birdhouses stacked in one corner. There were rocking horses, picture frames, small wooden crosses, even a hand-carved toy train. "They're beautiful," Rachel said. Ruth smiled. "My husband made those. He always said every piece of wood deserved a second chance." Rachel gently picked up one of the birdhouses. "Why aren't you selling these?" Ruth shrugged. "I never thought anyone would want them." Rachel looked around the workshop. "I think you're wrong." That evening, Rachel borrowed Ruth's old laptop. The internet connection was slow, but eventually she managed to upload photographs of the handmade crafts to a local community marketplace. She wrote only a few simple words beneath the pictures. "Handcrafted by a Vermont family. Every purchase helps preserve a century-old mountain cabin that has welcomed strangers for generations." She didn't expect much. Maybe someone would buy a birdhouse, or a picture frame. Anything would help. The next morning, her phone buzzed. One order. By lunchtime, there were 4. By evening, 11. Rachel stared at the screen in disbelief. "I don't understand." Ruth adjusted her glasses. "What happened?" "I think people are sharing the story." Walter stopped by that afternoon carrying a newspaper. "I figured you two should see this." Someone from the local newspaper had written a short article about the cabin and its history. The headline read, "The Little Cabin That Never Closed Its Door." Rachel looked at Ruth. "You didn't tell anyone about Samuel's letters." "I didn't." Walter grinned. "I may have mentioned them at the diner." Ruth laughed for the first time in days. "You've always had a big mouth." "So my wife tells me." Over the following week, something remarkable began to happen. People didn't just order handmade gifts. Some mailed handwritten notes. Others sent old family photographs, explaining that their grandparents had once taken shelter in the Anderson cabin during snowstorms decades earlier. One elderly woman wrote, "My father always said your grandparents saved his life during the winter of 1952. He never forgot their kindness. Please accept this small donation in his memory." Inside the envelope was a check. Another letter arrived from a retired truck driver. 40 years ago, I spent one freezing night in that cabin after my engine failed. Your grandmother fed me soup and refused to take a penny. I've wanted to repay that kindness ever since. Day after day, more letters arrived. Not because people felt sorry for Ruth, because they remembered. Kindness had a longer memory than anyone realized. One Saturday afternoon, Walter returned with exciting news. "The church wants to help. Ruth looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "They're organizing a community supper next weekend." Rachel smiled. "A fundraiser?" Walter nodded. "The whole town's coming." Ruth immediately shook her head. "I can't ask people for money." Walter smiled gently. "You aren't asking. They're thanking you." Ruth opened her mouth to object again. Rachel reached across the table and gently took her hand. "Sometimes," she said softly. "Allowing people to help is another way of showing them kindness." Ruth looked into Rachel's eyes. For so many years she had believed strength meant carrying every burden alone. Perhaps, she had been wrong. The following Saturday, the small church fellowship hall was filled beyond capacity. Families carried homemade casseroles. Children laughed as they helped decorate tables. Old neighbors hugged Ruth with tears in their eyes. Many hadn't seen her in years. One by one, people stood to tell stories. A farmer remembered getting lost during a blizzard as a boy. A retired teacher recalled how Ruth had stayed beside her husband's hospital bed all night, long after her shift had ended. A veteran remembered receiving a warm meal at the cabin after his truck slid off an icy road decades earlier. Rachel listened quietly from the back of the room. Until that evening, she had believed Ruth had rescued her. Now she realized something much bigger. Ruth had been quietly rescuing people her entire life. The cabin had never simply been a house. It had always been a place where hope was passed from one stranger to another. And perhaps that was exactly how hope had survived for generations. As the evening came to an end, Rachel stepped outside into the cold night air. Snowflakes drifted gently beneath the glow of the church lights. She looked up at the stars and smiled. For the first time in years, she wasn't praying for a place to belong. She had found one. Now, she was determined to make sure no one would ever have to close its door again. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow that had blanketed the mountains for months melted into small streams that wandered through the forest. The first birds returned to the maple trees surrounding the cabin, and every morning their songs drifted through the open kitchen window. Life settled into a quiet rhythm. Rachel no longer counted the days. She simply lived them. Every morning began before sunrise. She brewed coffee while Ruth prepared breakfast. Afterward, they divided the day's work without ever discussing it. Rachel repaired loose boards, painted old fences, answered messages from people ordering handcrafted gifts, and carefully packed each item before taking it to the post office in town. Ruth baked bread, wrote thank you letters to every donor, and spent afternoons teaching Rachel skills she had learned over a lifetime. Some lessons had nothing to do with cooking or sewing. They were lessons about people. Never rush someone who's hurting, Ruth often said. They're already caring enough. Or, sometimes the kindest thing you can offer isn't advice. It's your full attention. Rachel listened carefully. She wasn't simply learning how to care for a house. She was learning how to care for people. One afternoon, Walter stopped by carrying several grocery bags. "You've got visitors." Rachel looked outside. A young couple stood near the porch with two small children. Their old station wagon was parked at the edge of the driveway. Steam poured from beneath the hood. The father looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry to bother you. Our car overheated a few miles down the road. We're trying to get to New Hampshire." Before Rachel could answer, Ruth smiled. "Come inside." The words came so naturally that Rachel almost laughed. They were the exact same words Ruth had spoken to her only a few months earlier. Within minutes, the children were sitting beside the fireplace drinking hot chocolate. Their parents shared homemade soup while Walter examined the engine. Rachel watched quietly from the kitchen. Then she noticed something. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She looked around the cabin with wide eyes before asking, "Do you live here?" Rachel smiled. I do. The little girl nodded thoughtfully. Feels safe. Those 3 simple words stayed with Rachel long after the family had continued their journey. Safe. She couldn't remember the last place where she had ever felt that way. Perhaps this was the first. As spring continued, more travelers began stopping at the cabin. Some had car trouble. Others were caught in unexpected storms. A few simply needed directions or a warm meal before continuing down the mountain road. Word had spread through nearby towns about the little cabin that never turned anyone away. One evening, Ruth handed Rachel another bundle of Samuel Anderson's letters. I think these belong to you now. Rachel looked surprised. No. They're your family's history. Ruth smiled gently. History only matters if someone carries it forward. Rachel carefully held the letters. I don't know if I'm the right person. Ruth looked at her with quiet certainty. I do. Several days later, Rachel drove into town to deliver another shipment of handcrafted birdhouses. On her way back, she stopped outside the old community college where she had once dreamed of studying nursing. Students hurried between buildings carrying backpacks and textbooks. Rachel remained inside the truck for several minutes. She smiled, then sighed. Some dreams never completely disappear. That evening, Ruth noticed Rachel sitting alone on the porch. You've been quiet. Rachel hesitated. I drove past the college today. Ruth nodded. You still want to be a nurse? Rachel looked down at her hands. I don't think that dream belongs to me anymore. Why not? I'm too old. Ruth laughed. 24. Rachel smiled. I've already fallen behind. Ruth slowly settled into the rocking chair beside her. Rachel, I was 38 when I went back to school. Rachel stared at her. You were. I had 2 jobs. A husband, a little girl, and everyone told me I had waited too long. She smiled. They were wrong. Rachel looked toward the mountains. What if I fail? Ruth reached over and gently squeezed her hand. My dear, the only dream guaranteed to fail is the one you stop chasing. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine through the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell echoed across the hills. Rachel finally whispered, I don't know where to begin. Ruth smiled. You already have. The following week, Rachel enrolled in evening prerequisite classes at the community college. She would continue helping at the cabin during the day and study at night. The schedule would be exhausting, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was planning for it. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway, Rachel paused in front of the old family photographs. There was a picture of Ruth, her late husband, and little Hannah laughing beside a lake. Without thinking, Rachel picked up the frame and carefully dusted it. Then she placed it back exactly where it had been. She smiled. Thank you, she whispered. She wasn't certain whether she was speaking to Hannah or Linda, or perhaps to every person whose kindness had quietly guided her to this place. Maybe it didn't matter, because every act of love leaves something behind. Sometimes, it leaves another person strong enough to keep loving after us. That evening, Ruth watched Rachel studying anatomy at the kitchen table while homemade bread baked in the oven. She smiled to herself. Months earlier, she had believed she was opening her door to a weary stranger. Now, she understood the truth. God had not simply sent someone who needed a home. He had sent someone who would one day help countless others find hope. And Rachel finally understood something she had spent her entire life searching for. Home isn't the place where your story begins. It's the place where someone believes your story is far from over. A year passed more quickly than either Rachel or Ruth had imagined. The little cabin on the hillside looked different now. Fresh white paint covered the porch railings. New flower boxes rested beneath every window. The broken fence had been replaced. A hand-carved wooden sign stood beside the road. Anderson Cabin, a warm meal, a warm fire, a welcome for every traveler. People no longer drove past without noticing. Some stopped because they needed help. Others came because someone had once told them about the cabin where strangers were always treated like family. And many returned simply because kindness has a way of calling people back. Rachel had changed, too. Her evenings were filled with nursing classes. Her mornings still belonged to the cabin. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when she studied until after midnight before waking at dawn to split firewood or shovel snow. More than once, Ruth found her asleep over an open textbook at the kitchen table. Without saying a word, she would drape a blanket across Rachel's shoulders and quietly turn off the light. Some things mothers do never need to be explained. Spring turned into summer. One Saturday afternoon, a familiar pickup truck rolled into the driveway. Walter climbed out carrying a large envelope. "You ladies might want to sit down." Rachel exchanged a worried glance with Ruth. Walter handed Ruth the envelope. She opened it slowly. Inside was an official letter from the county. Her hands trembled as she read the first few lines. Then she stopped. Rachel looked at her anxiously. "What is it?" Ruth looked up, tears filling her eyes. "The taxes." Her voice broke. "They're paid." Rachel blinked. "What?" Walter smiled. "Not just the taxes. The maintenance fund has been set up too." Neither woman understood. Walter handed Rachel another sheet of paper. Attached to it was a list. Hundreds of names. Some belonged to people they knew. Most did not. Each had donated a little. $10, $25, $100. Some had given more. At the bottom was a handwritten note. "This cabin once gave my grandfather shelter during the winter of 1958. He said it was the first place where a stranger treated him like family. Please make sure its door never closes." Rachel slowly lowered the letter. She couldn't speak. Ruth covered her face with both hands and quietly cried, not because strangers had saved her home, because after so many years of believing she had been forgotten, she finally understood something beautiful. Kindness never disappears. It simply travels farther than we can see. As autumn approached, the cabin celebrated its 100th anniversary. The small gathering Ruth had expected turned into something much larger. Cars lined both sides of the mountain road. Children played beneath the maple trees. Neighbors carried homemade pies, fresh bread, and warm casseroles into the yard. Old photographs were displayed across long wooden tables. Many showed the cabin decades earlier. Others showed families standing on the same front porch after snowstorms had passed. Every picture carried another story. Every story began with an open door. Walter stepped onto the porch and gently tapped a spoon against his coffee mug. The conversations faded. "I've lived in these mountains for 72 years, he began. "And I've learned something." He smiled toward Ruth. "A house becomes a home because of the people inside it." Then he looked toward Rachel. "But a home becomes a blessing when someone chooses to share it." The crowd applauded. Rachel felt her cheeks grow warm. She had never been comfortable standing in front of people. Ruth gently nudged her forward. "I think they came to hear you." Rachel shook her head. "No. They came because of you." Ruth smiled. "They came because of us." Rachel slowly stepped onto the porch. She looked at the faces gathered before her. Some smiled. Some wiped away tears. Others simply waited. "I spent most of my life believing I was searching for a home," Rachel began. "But I was wrong." She paused. "I was really searching for people willing to open their hearts. She looked toward Ruth. "The night I came here, I thought I was asking for one night of shelter. Instead, I found the family I'd been looking for my entire life." The crowd grew silent. Rachel smiled through tears. "I used to believe family was something you were born into." She shook her head gently. "Now I know. Sometimes family is simply the person who opens the door when everyone else has closed theirs." Several people quietly wiped away tears. Even Walter looked toward the ground for a moment. That evening, after everyone had gone home, the cabin became quiet once again. Rachel and Ruth sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Ruth reached into the pocket of her sweater. She pulled out a small brass key. "I've been carrying this for months." Rachel looked at it curiously. "What is it?" "The front door?" Rachel frowned. "You already have one." Ruth smiled. "So should you." Rachel stared at the key resting in Ruth's hand. "I couldn't." "You can." "I don't want to take anything that isn't mine." Ruth closed Rachel's fingers gently around the key. "My dear, it stopped being only my home the day you walked through that door." Tears filled Rachel's eyes. She tried to speak. Nothing came. Ruth smiled. Then, for the first time, Rachel whispered the word she had carried in her heart for months. "Mom." The single word hung quietly in the evening air. Ruth closed her eyes. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. She reached for Rachel's hand. "I've been hoping I'd hear that again someday." They embraced beneath the fading autumn sky while the porch light glowed warmly behind them. The same light that had once guided a frightened young woman through the storm was now shining for someone else who might one day lose their way. Because some doors are built to protect us from the weather, but the most important ones are open to remind us that no one was ever meant to face life's storms alone. 5 years passed. The little cabin on the hillside was no longer difficult to find. Travelers knew it by the warm porch light that never seemed to go out. Locals simply called it the Anderson Cabin. Some came because they had lost their way. Some came because they had heard stories from their grandparents. Others arrived carrying burdens too heavy to explain, no matter the reason. The front door was always opened before anyone had to ask twice. Inside, the cabin looked much the same. The stone fireplace still filled the room with warmth. Samuel Anderson's letters rested safely inside the wooden box beneath a glass display. Fresh flowers stood beside Linda's old Bible on the mantel. Some things had changed. Others never needed to. Rachel Evans had become exactly what she once dreamed of becoming. A registered nurse. 3 days each week. She worked at Maple Ridge Community Clinic. The rest of her time belonged to the cabin, to Ruth, and to anyone who arrived needing hope more than answers. Ruth had grown older. Her steps were slower now. Her hands trembled when she poured tea, but her smile was brighter than it had been in decades. Loneliness had quietly packed its bags and left. One rainy autumn evening, almost exactly 5 years after Rachel first arrived, the wind returned to the mountains. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Rachel was placing another log onto the fire when she heard it. 3 gentle knocks. She froze. The sound felt strangely familiar. For just a moment, she wasn't standing in the living room anymore. She was 24 again. Cold, hungry, frightened, standing on this very porch, wondering whether anyone would answer. Rachel walked slowly to the front door. When she opened it, a young woman stood outside holding the hand of a little boy no older than 6. Their clothes were soaked. The child shivered quietly beside his mother. The young woman lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry to bother you." Our car broke down about a mile from here. I was wondering." She hesitated. "If we could stay on the porch until the rain lets up." Rachel smiled, not because she knew exactly what to say, because someone else had once said those very words to her. She opened the door a little wider. "No one waits out a mountain storm on this porch." The woman looked up. Rachel stepped aside. "Come inside." Behind her, Ruth closed her eyes for just a second. A tear slipped quietly down her cheek. History wasn't repeating itself. It was being carried forward. Later that evening, while the little boy slept peacefully beneath a handmade quilt, Rachel found Ruth sitting beside the fireplace holding Samuel Anderson's first letter. "You were right," Rachel whispered. Ruth looked up. "About what?" Rachel smiled. "This cabin was never built to keep people out. It was built so no one would have to face a storm alone." Ruth reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "No." She smiled softly. "It was never the cabin." Rachel looked puzzled. Ruth glanced around the room, then toward the family sleeping peacefully down the hallway. "It has always been the people willing to open the door." The fire crackled quietly between them. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, another family had found warmth. Another story had begun. Years from now, perhaps that little boy would remember only fragments of that night. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of rain against the roof, the kindness in a stranger's smile. Sometimes, that is all it takes to change a life. As dawn approached, Rachel stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands. The storm had passed. Golden light spread slowly across the mountains. She looked toward the winding road where she had once arrived with nothing but an old backpack and a frightened heart. It felt like another lifetime. She reached into her coat pocket. Inside rested 2 keys. One opened the front door. The other belonged to her locker at the clinic where she now cared for patients every day. 2 dreams. One she had spent years chasing. The other had quietly found her. She smiled as the first rays of sunlight touched the cabin. Then, almost without thinking, she whispered the same words Linda had once written inside a worn leather Bible. "Never let pain decide the kind of person you become." Rachel finally understood. Pain had shaped her journey, but kindness had shaped her future. And perhaps that is the greatest truth any of us will ever discover. We spend so much of our lives searching for a place called home, only to realize that home has been searching for us all along. Sometimes, it finds us on an ordinary night, in the middle of a storm, behind a simple wooden door, opened by someone who chooses compassion over fear, because the strongest homes are never built from timber or stone. They are built by ordinary people who refuse to let another human being face life's storms alone. And somewhere,